Hey, Dan, it's Donna. I got back on the phone. I don't think it's the teleconference connection, but I'm...
Hi, my name is Dan Barnett, and this is Closing the Loop, creating self-reflecting students in online classes. I'm a philosophy instructor at Butte College in Northern California, also the faculty distance learning coordinator, and I've received a 2012 Blackboard Catalyst Exemplary Course Award for Philosophy 18, Eastern Religions, and I'll be using that course for some examples later in this presentation. The agenda is pretty simple. We'll begin with frustration and move on to inspiration, then reformation, and finally, at the end, a bit of information. So we begin with frustration. As an instructor, I am invested in comments on student papers. Before the advent of the personal computer, I would cover my student papers with comments about grammar, about sentence structure, about philosophical concepts, about clarifying those concepts, about good writing, and so forth. I spent hours and hours. When I began to create online courses and students submitted their papers electronically, I still spent hours and hours in making comments on student papers. Oftentimes, grammar and spelling would enter in, and then I would write paragraph after paragraph about philosophical concepts of various kinds and how a student might better express those concepts, some lack of understanding and how the understanding could improve and so forth. And I was invested in these comments. I thought that whatever happened, students would, of course, look at their grade on the paper and then dive deep into all of the comments that I've been making. And there would be a kind of transformation among students so that subsequent papers would really reflect that students had internalized all of these comments that I've been making. But I was wrong. I realized one of the things I was doing is using a kind of fire hose approach in making so many comments about so many things. Those comments were unfocused, and students didn't know which way to turn. What did I really want them to do? Because there were so many different comments, it was hard for them to take all that information in. And secondly, I was a bit idealistic in thinking that students would read those comments and transform their subsequent papers. So I began to ask myself, well, where do those comments go? I spent so many hours making those comments. Where do they go? Yeah, oftentimes down the drain. Students would look at their grade, they would briefly look at some comments, and some students would read over the comments and benefit, I think, from them. But oftentimes, because the grade had been set and it was time to move on, those comments were kind of peripheral in student vision. And so I began to realize that all of these comments I had so invested in weren't really creating the kind of transformation that I wanted to have happen among students. And then inspiration began to strike. But before I talk about the inspiration, let me talk about how I had structured my online classes. I was thinking of these structures as kind of a jigsaw puzzle and putting the pieces together. And one big piece was discussions, central to my online courses in philosophy. What I wanted students to do is to bring reasons or evidence to a topic. And so my discussion prompts focused on not how a passage might make you feel or how you react to a passage, but, for example, in considering a Hindu hymn, I wanted students to read the hymn and then, in their discussions, tell me, is this hymn life-affirming overall or life-denying overall? What evidence is there in this hymn that gives you reason to think that it's one or the other, or maybe both? And so this helps focus student attention on the material that we're covering rather than simply elicit some kind of feeling or superficial response. I also wanted students in the discussion post to respond substantively to classmates, not just saying, well, I agree, or I disagree, or right on, or I don't like what you said. But for instance, in this discussion about this Hindu hymn, is it life-affirming or life-denying? Perhaps a student could say, well, you say the hymn is life-affirming, but have you considered this particular line in the hymn? This seems to be life-denying, and to add that substantive comment in hopes of eliciting even a response to that student. And then, as part of this puzzle that I was putting together, discussions led to discussion summaries, where I read the entire discussion and then summarized what the class was saying. These summaries, I thought, helped avoid certain discussion pitfalls that I had encountered early in teaching online. One of them was shutting down the conversation. When the instructor enters in and says, well, here's how you understand this particular philosophical concept, such as karma. Here's how you understand that. It kind of shuts down the conversation. Students then, instead of saying, well, let me wrestle with this idea. Oh, I don't think that's the way you should understand it. You should understand it this other way. It shut the conversation down. So students were saying, well, thank you very much for clarifying. And the discussion pretty much ended right there. There's also a problem when you enter into the discussion of playing favorites. There are some students, not necessarily the students who will end up with the highest grades, but there will be some students who write so provocatively, in a good sense, that the instructor is drawn to those posts and want to comment and to prize out some of the insights that the student is expressing. You've probably had that experience in class or online. A student may not get the idea completely right, but there's a germ of something, and you want to nurture that. And so if I began to respond to those students and those posts, other students who would be writing more prosaic posts would say, well, wait a minute, you're playing favorites. Why don't you respond to what I have to say? And at one point, I even considered some kind of quota system that I would respond to each student twice during this particular period, but that was certainly artificial and really didn't help the conversation. Then there's the problem of writing to the instructor, that if the instructor is in active presence inside that discussion, what I found was that students would begin writing to me and not really pay much attention to what other students were saying around in other posts in the discussion. They were simply writing to me. And so instead of a discussion, it became kind of a monologue. And so a discussion summary gets away from that idea. The instructor is not entering into the discussion. Instructor's presence comes after the discussion. And what I began to do then was to take the summary of what I had read and created a kind of template that made that summary, put it into a Word document, or I use Evernote, and I kept that summary from semester to semester, constantly changing it, adding to it, revising it, reforming it. But this summary helps bring order to chaos. It helps students get the 50,000 feet view to see what the whole discussion was about and where the class was going. I also use anonymous discussion excerpts. As I'm reading the various discussions, I'm finding gems to pull out and to make comments on. These are anonymous. Students oftentimes, though, when they see the discussion summary, can see their own comments and some of the comments that I've been making on their comments, and then hoping students will read these comments. So I thought, here's the whole puzzle. I've got a discussion that really focuses on student-student interaction, that presents an interesting, provocative kind of question, and prevents students from simply writing to me, from ending the conversation that way, and then adding the discussion summary and hoping that students would really glom on to what I had to say as I summarized the entire discussion. So part of me said, students will read the summaries for the sheer love of learning, because they've already received a grade for their discussion, and the summaries were kind of gravy. And students would just, oh, I want to see what the instructor said. And of course, another part of me said, what strange words are these? And I realized that I was facing the same kind of difficulty. So I had part of the puzzle. I had the discussions, I had the summaries, but I needed something else. And that's when inspiration struck, the missing piece. Here's the question that I ask myself. What if students had to revisit their discussion posts in light of my comments in the discussion summary? Aha! And that led to a reformation. As you see, the LED bulbs are turning on. Not light bulbs, but the LED bulbs. These are energy efficient and environmentally friendly bulbs. The insight was, the missing piece was a private journal. And so in the discussion summary, I realized I had to do one more thing. In addition to asking students to read the summary, I wanted students to read their original posts. I want them to read the reflection questions at the end of the summary. And then I wanted them to post their responses in the private journal. Well, that's not just one thing. That's a whole group of things that I wanted students to do. But it was based in the discussion summary and moved on to creating a private journal entry. And so here is a typical picture of a middle-sized discussion summary. There's a lot for students to read. What I began in the summary generally is with a YouTube video, personal comments about some of the themes, some of the ideas that I've noticed in the discussion. And I found it's helpful, at least for some students, to see my facial expression, to catch the tone of my voice, and to hear a kind of extemporaneous speaking about their discussions and the themes, as well as read the more structured text summary that goes below. Now, the nice thing about it is, if these YouTube videos are created for the sole purpose of that one discussion and not going to be repurposed or used again, then that's ephemeral. And so you don't have to do closed captioning unless, of course, there is some kind of accommodation request, and then you'll work with the disabled students office. But that's the nice thing, that you can create a YouTube video on the fly, and you can just put it in there so students can get close connection with you, the instructor, as you're talking about what students have posted. There are also discussion excerpts, that anonymous ones that I've used in the summary, and that sometimes I will comment on individually in brackets to prize out some particular understanding and to encourage and laud a student for getting it right, but also some misunderstandings to point out some areas that are commonly misunderstood. Then there's the bulk of my comments, and then finally at the very end, the journal reflection questions. Here's an example of one. This deals with a Neo-Confucian writer named Chu Shi, who wrote against Buddhism, and specifically against what he thought was the Buddhist idea of what is popularly known as reincarnation. And so students who had looked at Buddhism some weeks earlier kind of went on their merry way into Confucianism, sort of forgot about the Buddhist tradition, and now they are confronted with Chu Shi, who says the Buddhist tradition is wrong. And then in the discussion, I asked students, all right, what do you think about Chu Shi's argument? Does he have it right or wrong? Chu Shi was saying, look, if Buddhism is correct and there's a reincarnation going on, then it ought to be one for one. Somebody leaves this planet and somebody comes to this planet. And so there ought to be never any increase in population. Well, that misunderstands much of the Buddhist tradition. But students didn't remember that. Students thought, wow, this is really an incredible argument, that because the population, the human population, is changing radically, it has changed radically, then this argument must be really a great argument on the part of Chu Shi. So in this journal question, what I wanted students to do is to go back and reread their initial postings and then respond to these journal questions, and then to reflect on perhaps the difference between their original postings, their original discussion postings, and how they think now after having read my summary and read the additional comments that I've put into that discussion summary. Well, this is what happens. First, students get a kind of emotional distance. Now, it's very important to realize that in asking students to go back a couple of weeks to look at a previous discussion, something that's already been graded, you are asking something that's out of the ordinary, and so you need very clear instructions about what students need to do. Most of us are used to going forward in our courses, just like with PowerPoint presentation. When was the last time you saw a presenter use PowerPoint and go backwards to review all of that information? We go forwards, and oftentimes in student minds, well, that week is over, and let's move on to the next week. And maybe there's some missing continuity there. This is a way to build in that continuity, to have students go back and revisit, but you've got to make clear what you want them to do. And the added benefit is an emotional distance. It's been several weeks now since they made that posting, and so they don't have that emotional immediate investment that they did, and they can look more dispassionately at what they wrote. Early on in the semester in my Eastern Religions course, we look at attempts to define religion. And I give students so-called definitions that are really, shall we say, kind of biased observations, mostly against the whole idea of any kind of religion. And students are supposed to take the information from the textbook and from my presentations and evaluate these definitions. And they get very emotional because oftentimes, for example, you think of Karl Marx, religion is the opiate of the people, or the opium of the people. And so some students who really don't like organized religion, for instance, who don't have a religious tradition of their own, you can see them being drawn in. Yeah, they will say. Karl Marx is expressing exactly what's going on with religion, that it's a way to keep the masses in control, for instance. And then other students will chime in, those who have a religious tradition, and kind of defend religion. And so it goes back and forth with a lot of emotional investment. 2 weeks later, not so much emotional investment, so students can look back. And there's also heightened curiosity because they have to look back, and they kind of wonder, well, I can't quite remember, did I say that? What did I say? Did I agree with my instructor? Did I disagree with my instructor? So there's a kind of curiosity that's piqued, even looking at the anonymous quotations that I've drawn from the post. Did I say that? I think I said something like that. I want to go back and make sure. And so there's this heightened curiosity. And then there's this review of the previous content, a blast from the past, as I said a bit earlier. That is, it's making this continuity, it's connecting up with material that has gone before. There's this engagement with the content that didn't happen before. At first it was a discussion assignment. Students completed the assignment, they had some emotional investment, and then they moved on. And now they're moving back to that particular assignment and looking at it with fresh eyes, with not quite so much emotional investment, and yet at the same time they're engaging with the content. We may have moved on to a different tradition, a religious tradition, and so they're going to have to go back into Buddhism and say, oh, let's see, what was that now? What was that? And that's good. They are comparing and contrasting comments and posts with my particular summary comments with their posts, and they're seeing, have they caught something that what I've said? Did what I say help them understand better than expressed in their original posts? They have a reflective perspective. They've already gotten the grade on the discussion, and so now they're going back and they're seeing, well, what have I said really? Did I understand this properly? It's amazing as I read journal entries, and most learning management systems have something like a private journal that you can use in setting this up. Students are very frank about themselves and their understanding. Not always, but oftentimes they will say, wow, I really did not understand that. I really missed the boat on that one. Really misunderstood karma or the Buddhist idea of reincarnation. I really misunderstood some of these things. So they're very, very frank in self-assessing. I see cognitive change. Students who have read my discussion summary and have read their own original posts are saying, wow, I understand this better now. If you ask me now I think I understand it. I can make sense of this. But there's also affective change, a change not just in feeling toward the subject, but a change in attitude toward the subject matter. Sometimes students, if they're learning something brand new, and particularly a challenging concept, something that seems to be at odds perhaps with their own religious commitment or tradition, they sometimes will become very defensive. They will see this new material as either silly or ridiculous because students don't understand it. It's very easy to label something they don't understand as silly or ridiculous. And in that regard, students are just like us. We have a tendency to do exactly the same thing. But when students read their original post and my comments and then come to improve their understanding, then they're engaging with the material in an academic way, but their attitude is beginning to change because they're making sense of this. It doesn't just seem silly. It doesn't just seem ridiculous. They're saying, now I see how this fits in to an overall scheme, for example, of Buddhist cosmology and how it doesn't fit with a Neo-Confucian cosmology. Wow. And so there's an attitude change because students are beginning to understand, and their attitude toward the material, because they're understanding it, is changing as well. A few journal excerpts from real students, and I've highlighted a few phrases that warmed my heart. One student wrote that, I did not think logically about this particular question. And so that student was able to say, I looked at your summary and I looked at my original comments and I see that I really wasn't thinking logically about it. One student said, how embarrassing that I was making the same mistake that you said many in class were making at the beginning of your discussion summary. And the student adds, I think I could do a much better job now discussing the concepts than what I did in my original post. Oh, how wonderful to see that. Doesn't that warm your heart as an instructor? One student said, well, after reading the description on reincarnation, my understanding and essay on his controversy is wrong. I was wrong. It seems like Chu Shi fell into the trap that we all do, in that he only scraped the surface of something. Here's a student self-revealing, I only scraped the surface. I just went on a kind of a popular understanding of Buddhism. It seemed like Chu Shi was saying exactly the right thing, and now I see that his argument is really questionable. I did misunderstand, says this student. Wow. Isn't that great to know that about yourself in this private journal area and to feel comfortable enough with the instructor to present that self-understanding? Another student said the discussion summary was eye-opening. And the student admits, I also fell into the emotional trap, and this is talking about these definitions of simply giving his or her views of religion, whether it's a positive or negative sort of thing, rather than evaluating these so-called definitions for adequacy as an academic definition. And for a student to post that in this journal and to say, I've learned the lesson of following the discussion directions more closely. Wow, that's wonderful. I love it. Another student said, I'm new to this way of thinking, so I'm glad that these discussion summaries make us dig deep. That gives me evidence that students are reading, because they're reading, they want a grade on their journal. Of course they do. But they're reading and they're coming to a better understanding. And so my comments are not just going down the drain. They are arming students to better understand what they wrote 2 weeks ago. Another student said, "You called me out on my contradiction." For a student to be comfortable enough to express that, to say, in your discussion summary and in looking at what I wrote originally, there was a contradiction there and you called me out on that. And my heart is just warming for a student to see that and to learn from that experience. And another student, "You proved my thought on that wrong, but you did it in an understandable and reasonable way in that discussion summary." And so what you said in your summary makes things a little bit more logical, makes more logical sense. And so what's happening? An attitude is changing. An attitude is changing. This now begins to make sense. I'm understanding it better. And so my attitude toward unfamiliar subject matter is changing. And finally, information. Just to summarize, the whole idea of closing the loop now is you begin with a discussion, a provocative discussion, but one that elicits not just feelings about, well, how do you feel about this, but that demands that students use their understanding and the tools that you've given them to work on a common project of understanding a text, for instance. Is this text life-affirming or life-denying? And then staying out of the discussion so students can interact with each other and amazing learning can take place. Not always, certainly not always, but it can be amazing to see as one student interacts with another and says, "Wow, you helped clarify things. Now I think I understand a little bit better," and the learning ripples through the entire discussion. And then the discussion summary from the instructor using anonymous excerpts from student posts, and then some journal entry requirements, some questions that you want students to reflect on in their private journal. That closes the loop so those discussion comments don't go down the drain, but they serve to enrich students, to help them in their understanding, to enable them to go to that next level in many cases. As they come to a better understanding, their attitude is changed and they are prepared to encounter the next material. This is just exciting to me and has lit up my own mind as I think about what's happening as students are expressing these things in their private journals. Now, some things to remember. Be sure to focus on taking stock type evaluation questions for your journals rather than reaction or feeling questions. The feelings, the reactions will come in naturally. You don't have to ask for them, but have them take stock. Have them do this comparison between what they wrote originally in their discussions and after having read the discussion summary, how is it now as you're having them write in their journals. Amazing things can happen. And look not just for new understanding of content, but look for change in attitude as well. Base the journal grades on the quality of self-reflection. And it's not just the students who will get the highest grades who have the best self-reflection. Sometimes you will see students who have been struggling with a concept in the course, for instance, begin to come to an understanding after reading through their earlier posts, reading the discussion summary, writing in their journal. They begin to grasp a little bit of what you want. It's a wonderful thing to see right there on the page. And reward some real efforts to grasp difficult material. It may not be perfect. You may be tempted to write 1,000,000 comments if you were back in the old days. But what you've done is you've created a curiosity, you've created an excitement on the part of the student, in some cases at least. You've created this sense of, I am understanding a little bit more than I did before. And that's a wonderful thing to see played out in the journal. And don't forget that tweaking is forever. You may have a journal question you think, this is going to be great, and maybe it turns out to be less than great. That means I've got to tweak this. And so there's this constant tweaking, not only of journal questions, but of the supporting discussion questions that students interact with first and deal with first. How can you connect these up so that the discussion is not the end of the matter, that students then are taken on and on this journey of self-discovery, of better understanding, of better attitudes. I hope you'll make a connection with me. I'd love to hear from you about your experiences. If you've never done this closing the loop idea before, how is it working for you? If you've done something like this, what are the things that you have learned? Contact me at Butte College. I've got email addresses, Google Voice numbers, all kinds of ways for you to contact me. But I hope this idea of closing the loop, of making self-reflecting students in online courses, is something that you can grasp and get excited about, and that students can grasp and get excited about, and their learning is transformed from simply finishing a discussion assignment and moving on to going back and thinking and reflecting on what they've said and expressing newfound knowledge and better attitudes toward materials, an excitement and a curiosity that they might have had developed during the semester as they express those in their journal. Best of success to you. This is Dan Barnett. Thank you for watching and listening.